All right, everybody. It says I'm live. If I'm actually live, let me know in the chat. And thank you for being here on another Monday night where we're going to discuss some of the happenings going on in our country right now. There's a lot going on around the world, and it's hard to focus on anything individually. So it's good to focus on a subject at a time when we can. And tonight we're going to talk about incitement justification, which in my opinion is on its way. And we'll discuss what that means here in just a minute. But first, let's make sure everything sounds good, looks good. Let me know in the chat. And of course, thank you to Midway USA for making live streams like this one possible. They support the channel and do what they can when it comes to supplying me with awesome equipment. So a big thanks to Midway USA. Good evening, Dave Sickles, Mr. Landfill, 5x5. 5x9 says Porky Prepper. 5x5 from War Donkey. 5x5 MP Mike H says, and Slaughterhouse Floor says, woo! So I think we're doing good because we got the Ric Flair going in the house now, you know? 22 Magnum, baby, says Hugh Junnett. Good to see you as well. I also want to mention that MagicPepperBeef.com supports these live streams directly. And if you go to MagicPepperBeef.com, you can find high-quality freeze-dried, shelf-stable, New York strips, filet mignon, ribeye, whatever steak you want. Not, hamburger beef, but steak that'll last 10 years minimum for the best freshness, but upwards of 25 years. Use Magic Prepper as a discount code to get 15% off any order at MagicPepperBeef.com. I'll have links down below in the description as well as in the pinned comment. We got to support these live streams because I like to make them happen. And of course, it's awesome if you can support yourself in the meantime as well. So 5x5 from Maryland says James Greeley. If you're on the replay crew, make sure you check in the comments below. Thank you all for coming back tomorrow, the next day, a year from now. Any of you are awesome because, not everybody can make it this late at night. And I can appreciate the fact that you still come back to get the information. I saw Ohio, figured I better stop. Watch it burn, 63 says. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Just interesting things happening. Cherokee Survival, yes, I heard about the warrant being served and the shootout that ensued thereafter. And to me, it just represents the current state of our country. People are, let's just say, on the edge. Things are becoming more dangerous no matter which side of the equation you find yourself on. 1733 here says Dom VDG. All right, so let's keep moving forward. We have things to talk about, okay? A lot of stuff's happening right now. We could talk about every facet of the planet, but domestically, issues are springing up, and I think we're currently in the initial thralls of another summer of love type situation because we have organized protests happening all around the country, and they're starting to escalate, and there's no reason to believe they won't eventually reach the degree of what we all witnessed back in 2020. Also an election year. Crazy enough, I know. So the coincidental aspect is definitely there, but at the same time, these particular protests definitely have other forms of funding and organization from places that might not necessarily have our best interests in mind. So that's why we're going to focus somewhat on that tonight and talk about how the justification incitement is on its way and it will be used by both sides. And that's something that I think we should all be very clear about. Regardless of how you feel about the situation that's being protested, or regardless of how you feel things should be handled regarding, the First Amendment or the rights of those who are being, I don't know what to say, arrested at this point in time. Well, the real consideration needs to be how will this be used by those who have the power to use it to the next level? And I think we are on our way to seeing that occurring here very shortly. Whether or not that be from a law enforcement perspective of a authoritarian type crackdown that could be very problematic for us in the future, or if these events will be leveraged by those who want to create more chaos and damage to us here in the United States that will use these events to further their agenda. And there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to this exact concept. So let's jump into it. Now, before we get started, I want to take a little bit of a trip back into history, just to give you some ideas about why some concerns might be valid when it comes to some of the activities that we're currently witnessing, okay? Remember the 1970s? Me neither, because I wasn't born yet. But there was some stuff going on in the 1970s regarding radicalized protesting, okay? And this is from Time magazine, which we all know has their share of problems, right? But this is just a reminder as to why we should be concerned about what we're currently witnessing, okay? Just a quick historical review. It may be hard to recall now, but there was a time when most Americans were decidedly more blasé about bombing attacks. This was during the 1970s, when protest bombings in America were commonplace, especially in hard-hit cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Nearly a dozen radical underground groups, dimly remembered outfits such as the Weather Underground, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure had ties with Hillary Clinton, the New World Liberation Front, and the Symbionese Liberation Army set off hundreds of bombs during that tumultuous decade. So many, in fact, that many people all but accepted them as part of daily life. As one woman sniffed to a New York Post reporter after an attack by a Puerto Rican independence group in 1977, "Oh, another bombing? Who is it this time?" Okay? That just goes to demonstrate that this history of radicalism using tactics of a related nature goes back quite a ways and should be expected to be repeated again. That's how these radicalized groups operate, and they are currently operating within these organized protest bodies. And not necessarily everyone in the protest have to be completely complicit in these activities. Most of them are unaware or ignorant to a lot of the organizations that are behind what actually generates all of this momentum. And then, of course, they will be ignorantly part of the situation if it occurs. And it also goes to show that there could be valid reasons for why law enforcement might be taking additional measures or considering additional measures when it comes to how to quell some of these protests due to the inherent danger that they currently present. But in doing so, we could have either side of the equation crossing the line of what's legal and crossing the line of, well, trampling on top of our rights in the process. So it's a very difficult situation, and it's also something that's ripe for, let's just say, a non-factual attack of sorts, if you know what I mean, okay? So, late but here, Desert 1776, well, we still like you. We're glad you made it. Very much appreciate you. All right. What am I talking about? Well, I'm going to start you off with a thought-provoking concept. And this is because I'm trying to focus domestically right now because this is what's most likely to affect those of us here in the United States. But even if you live overseas, these protests are happening where you are likely as well if you live in a Western society. So be aware that this could affect you just as easily. But I'm going to take a worst-case scenario approach to the scenario because I'm a fringe weirdo prepper. And that's what we do, you know? So here's the thing. Right now, with the large scale of these events and the purpose behind them, right? The victimhood of the rallying cry and the support of the perceived victimhood being the reason to rally, this would be a ripe scenario for a group with malicious intent to use it as a way to prove their point. And we know how governments, militaries, and organized entities have proven their point in the past through things that weren't necessarily very truthful, right? Especially in regards to some sort of an attack. Which is why this concerns me. Because of the groups that are involved, because of the extreme ideologies that are involved, and because of the generation of support that could be leveraged thereafter based on the argument for why these things are so important. I think you get my drift. But of course, I'm speaking in such a way that will allow us to have this conversation freely in an open forum. So, here's food for thought. And generally, in case you're new here, well, first off, if you're new here, you should probably subscribe so that way you can be here for weekly conversations like this one, but you should also hit the like button because I'm supposed to say those things. But if you're new here, we generally focus on recent events that have happened within the last 7 days. But in order to provide context to some of this information, I try to go back in history every so often to give you ideas about how you should be digesting this information through a lens of, let's just say, investigation, right? We're looking to see how this could turn out or what this could turn into rather than just trying to stare at it blankly at face value. So, in order to do that, let's create some context here. This is from Campus Safety. It's from 2017, still relevant because it's just about the safety on campuses in the United States. Why do terrorists target colleges and universities? Okay, just something to consider, especially as we move forward, and why some of these concerns that I currently have actually exist. There are multiple theories for why campuses are being targeted. The attack at the Ohio State University campus on November 28, 2016 was not the first incident at a U.S. college or university classified by federal officials as being caused by radically inspired Islamist extremism. However, the attack using a car and a knife as weapons reflected the latest terrorist strategy, resulting in 12 victims directly injured by the attacker, among them students, faculty, and staff. In 2014, the University of Maryland's Global Terrorism Database noted the growing number of educational institutions worldwide that have been targeted in terrorist attacks over the previous 10 years. The following year, the BBC reported that terror attacks on schools and colleges around the world have risen to higher levels than at any point in more than 40 years. According to another report by the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, more than 3,400 terrorist attacks targeting educational institutions took place in 110 countries between 1970 and 2013. Top leaders in the FBI have issued warnings that schools and universities in the United States were vulnerable as soft targets for terrorism. The big question is, why? Counterterrorism experts have put forward several reasons for why terrorists of any stripe might target higher education institutions. Here are those theories. Number one, colleges and universities are iconic symbols of education, democracy, and a free society. They represent and preserve culture and diversity in many forms. According to Jake Flanagan's Why Terrorists Target Schools and Universities, outside of the United States, attacks aim to impede education and independent thought, counter-religious activity perceived as a threat to ideology, and preserve the status quo. Western style of education in the minds of some groups in the Middle East represents the domination of colonialism and channels for Christian religious proselytizing. Said that wrong completely. According to Why Terrorists Attack Education by Naveed Hussain, this stands in contrast to the accepted Quranic-based schools in those areas of the world. Colleges and universities are rich targets with infrastructure, research labs, medical facilities, art collections, and historic buildings. High concentrations of faculty and students in outside venues occur at regular intervals during class changes. Likewise, campuses host mass gatherings for sporting events, commencements, concerts, and political events. Interruption of any of these would garner immediate and widespread media attention for a cause. Why would that particular line be relevant right now? I don't know. Most campuses are open or have less security measures, making them ideal soft targets. It was a chance combination of circumstance, policy, and training that caused Officer Alan Harajuku to be at the right place at the right time to quickly resolve the attack on the OSU campus. Okay? The number of foreign students attending U.S. colleges and universities is at an all-time high, reports the Los Angeles Times. China, India, and Saudi Arabia send the most students, and those from Iran increased by about 8% from the year before, with the highest U.S. enrollment of Iranian students in 3 decades. It would be difficult to determine how many students are legal permanent residents, such as the OSU attacker Abdul Razak Ali Ertan, who was a Muslim Somali refugee. Of concern to some is the process for accepting foreign nationals into a U.S. university and how they are vetted. Once accepted, what support and services are offered on campus to assist foreign students with adjusting to American culture. Okay? So, does that explain maybe why I might have some concerns? I think so. But I also think that moving forward, we're going to see that these protests are escalating. They are expanding. They're reaching all over the country at this point in time. The interactions between police and the protests are also escalating. And this is why it's kind of alarming. Not because I expect something bad to happen, because I personally hope nothing does, but because the environment is ripe for someone to take advantage of the situation. And either side taking advantage of the situation is problematic. We know how the government likes to take hold of security and never let go. And we also know how these groups are easily infiltrated by instigators and collaborators and sympathizers who are willing to go the extra mile to make their point and generate support for their cause. Don't forget that one of the priorities of most terrorist organizations is to generate support through their actions, right? And their actions are what people latch onto who have that desperation or that need of belonging to something, which personally is probably, at least in my opinion, a lot of the reason why so many young people are attracted to this movement, because they need that belonging, right? That doesn't mean that's going to change the outcome per se, but that could be a big reason for why this is going the way it is. All right, let's see here. Somebody just chimed in with a super chat, I'm pretty sure, that I missed, and I feel bad about it. Florida Sheepdog, colleges are filled with undeveloped minds. Well, and that's true, and they are easily influenced people because, well, let's be honest, that's why they're there, to learn and to absorb whatever it is that they can during their education. And sometimes the things we absorb need to be filtered out. But if you're not wrung out like a sponge from time to time, you grow bacteria. Sorry for my overly scientific analogy there. Mike H. Rush used to say campy. Okay. And then Magic Prepper, good evening. Well, good evening to you as well, South Florida DCL. I'm glad you're here. So, just so you all know, we've got some other things to talk about now. And I wanted to frame everything in that context. I wanted to not only give you that historical tidbit about how we had protest-related bombings throughout the entire 1970s and how groups that are structured similarly to what we're seeing right now happening in the country were behind those bombings, and just to kind of demonstrate what level some of these groups will actually go to get their message across. But I also wanted to talk about the fact that education centers are soft targets for possible terrorist attacks, which then can be leveraged by both sides, right? Terrorists alike, not to mention the authorities, because everybody likes to take advantage of what they can. We know that. We definitely know that. And we've learned a lot since 2020, whether or not it be about rioting or the response to said riots or lack thereof or lockdowns and mandates. We learned quite a bit. So maybe that's where some of my concern comes from as well, based on how these events can be leveraged against us, the regular people who are just trying to go about our day and raise our families. So here's where we're at currently, and this is why I brought all that information up to you. Columbia deadline passes as protesters refuse to leave, post signs saying Columbia will burn. Now, of course, these people are being punished based on their activities, and after that punishment, they're upset, they're angry, and they may be lashing out in a way that might not actually represent how they'll act thereafter, but these threats have to be taken at face value because that's the best we can see at this point in time. And this is what's happening. So this is why I wanted to frame everything before we have this conversation, to just give you a concept as to where things might be heading and why we should be vigilant, okay? As we reported earlier, Columbia University had exhausted negotiations with protesting students and set a 2 p.m. deadline for the students behind the encampment there to pull up stakes or face disciplinary action. Now, I do want to mention that Columbia, and here, I'll just pull this up really quick so we can move on in that article first, okay? And I just want to make sure everybody's well aware of everything going on, okay? Columbia University is a private university. It is not a public university. And so when it comes to the First Amendment and things of that nature, trespassing is not protected by the First Amendment, right? You cannot come on my property and scream at me with a megaphone and expect me to not have you removed because you're on my property. But in a public forum, not much can be done about that, especially if permits are issued and everything else, things that shouldn't necessarily be required for First Amendment rights to exist, in my opinion. But you can't break into my house just because you want to tell me something, right? That's not how the First Amendment works. I will then be able to make sure you are not in my house anymore and possibly not able to do much thereafter. But I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware, Columbia University at least, not all other schools we're going to talk about here just in a minute, but Columbia is a private institution. So that does kind of change that equation when people start to get worked up about the First Amendment aspects of some of these things, which I understand that concern because that's a very slippery slope when it comes to curbing freedom of speech. Like, it's a very important aspect of the Bill of Rights, right? That's why it's number one. Without it, we don't have freedom. But there are circumstances we have to consider, especially when it comes to private property. You can't break into my house at 3 a.m. and yell in my ear just because of the First Amendment, right? So, I do want to see here. Two Doctors Homestead, great live, great videos as always. Thank you. Well, thank you as well. I really appreciate that super chat. Let's see. Gene A needs to speak to my manager, says Sherman Sales. Okay. Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I think Gene A's been around for a long time, so I hope they don't have any exorbitant grievances. I'm here to try to talk with everybody. Okay. And then also I do want to say, do not feel the need to super chat me. I want you guys to be preparing for yourselves as best you can, and that's why Midway USA and MagicPepperBeef.com support these live streams so that I can put the information out here for free. But if you do want to support the channel directly, I do appreciate it, and I just want you to know that I'm very grateful. Okay, so but I do hope you all are preparing yourselves for whatever's on its way. A lot of stuff's happening. Let's be honest. Okay, so back to the whole Columbia thing, because people are saying it will burn, which I don't think is a good thing. The deadline has now come and gone, with the students saying they wouldn't move without force. So it looks like it's time to fish or cut bait for the university. Is that a saying that people actually say? I don't think I've ever heard that before. As we noted, the school has identified the students in the encampment so they know who to go after and discipline. If they didn't sign out with the school from the protest by 2 p.m., they were going to be on the hook, the administration said. But the response of the protesters to the school's notices to vacate the area was not good and doesn't bode well for the future. Multiple people posted about the alleged response to the university, including "I ain't reading all that" and "Columbia will burn." And these are some of the signs or some of the papers that were left behind during this protest scenario. And like I said, this could just be angsty youth writing something inflammatory because they're mad. And as a teenager, I might have done some things similarly I should not have done, right? So I can try to relate to this feeling of, you're going to suspend me from college, the one I pay for, by the way, because of me flexing my First Amendment rights, which, like I said, there are circumstances involved with that at this specific university. I understand the anger there. But this is a threat, and it has crossed the line into being threatening in nature rather than just being somebody's angry words, right? So the problem with this is that in 2020, we saw a lot of institutions burn during protests, which I think a lot of people remember well and have that lingering thought of, well, is this where this is going to go? And this is not necessarily indicative that this will happen here, but it is giving you a glimpse into the sentiment of the people who are involved, right? And that's problematic for me because we don't need any more of the country to burn from within, right? We need to work together because all the outside threats and the foreign adversaries and even these foreign wars that may or may not have justifications but are costing a lot of money for you and I, right? I think $500 to $600 per family basically at this point. I don't think we can afford it anymore. But anyway, that surely sounds like a threat. Oh, I guess they agree with me. Is the university going to take this seriously, or are they going to just roll over by these characters again? This is getting past ridiculous at this point when they do things like this. No, they're not anti-war. They're calling for the fall of Israel and Intifada. What does the administration think that means? How do they think they're going to go on with this chaos in occupying everything? Now, here's the thing, okay? What side of the equation you get your information from will demonstrate this to you in a different flavor, depending on what they usually side with. So, depending on the news outlet, these protests will be called pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, anti-genocide, anti-war, and many other things, right? So, I'm not trying to say that this is exactly everything that's happening. I'm trying to just show you and demonstrate the possibility of this escalating and accelerating into something much more dangerous. And that's where my concerns lie. I'm not necessarily concerned with the outcome of these people's demands. I'm more concerned about what this is going to do to, our fellow Americans, which is what all of our concerns should be, okay? I mean, this is what's happening on college campuses around the country right now. If Columbia doesn't get a handle on this soon, this is going to descend into something very bad. It's already well on its way because they have let this go for so long. When you show weakness, the left will walk all over you, and that's what's happening here because Columbia is run by ineffective and weak liberals. Just another example of how that kind of weakness doesn't work. That's what this article says. Those are not my words. That's the words of this article. Now, I have always tried my best to make this a place where people from different backgrounds, ideologies, thought processes, and everything else can still come to get prepared, because at the end of the day, I don't think Americans are my greatest enemy, but a lot of Americans do think other Americans are their greatest enemy, and that's a very problematic scenario for me, because when everything goes to hell, it's going to be Americans relying on each other to rebuild or survive, right? And I don't think many of us are going to care who we voted for if the number one priority is, hey, do you have clean water and is anyone growing crops, right? So I'm trying my best to still create that environment here. But I think, obviously, there's going to be some clear bias towards being more conservative from my own personal opinions, especially related to things regarding the Second Amendment and whatnot. But that doesn't mean that I have an inherent hatred for anybody who doesn't agree with me. And I think that's something I wanted to kind of verify for anybody who might be questioning that, because I can talk to anyone. I don't have to agree with you to have a conversation, and I don't have to agree with you to think that preparedness is a good idea, right? Because I don't want to see your demise no matter what the situation, unless you're distinctly my enemy. And I would hope that most Americans are not. But I do know we live in a very tumultuous society at this point in time, and it's very unfortunate that some look at me as being the problem. Trust me on that when it comes to hate mail, comment section, veiled threats, stuff that just happens, when you're online. But that is not my stance. So those people can have whatever fun they want in thinking that they have everything figured out. But in reality, post a survival scenario, we're all just going to be glad we have someone else there to help us out. That's just my opinion. Gen X Gemini, coffee. I can approve of that. Delicious. All right. Northern Girl Hobbies, thank you. Thanks for being here. I think I saw USMC Devil Dog in here earlier too, modding, and I appreciate all the mods. As always, very beneficial and lots of gratitude from my side, okay? So this isn't just relegated to Columbia. There's other things happening now as well. Like I said, this is escalating. And the escalation of this protest movement is what's going to create incitement justification, which is, title of tonight's live stream. And in case you weren't 100% sure about what that means, it just means doing things in such a way that may even be illegal to move things forward in a way that's beneficial for a cause in many ways. And justifying those illegal actions because of said cause would kind of create the picture for you of what incitement justification is. So if something bad were to happen to a large group of the protesters, who does that give justification to? Well, of course, the protest group itself and the ones who align with it. And right now, we know that certain entities, Palestine Action now, there was something wrong with me right then because things I've said in the past suddenly were just completely blacklisted, but that's a different story. Some of these groups have ties to people who do very, very bad things, okay? So they'll have justification to do bad things because guess what? It's in response to this bad thing that you did to us. And of course, from the authoritarian side, federal government, law enforcement, or whoever else might be involved, we have the justification for possibly doing things that weren't necessarily legal or possibly violating rights because of the danger that is being perceived to come out of these groups and out of these events. Riot police used pepper spray as dozens arrested at University of Texas pro-Gaza protest encampment. And now, so this outlet is calling it a pro-Gaza protest, okay? And this is The Independent. Like I said, depends on where you read it from exactly what these protests are being labeled as, okay? Scores of heavily outfitted riot police descended on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin on Monday to clear out a protest encampment rallying against the Israel-Hamas war, the second time a large police presence has been called in response to students there in less than a week. Like I said, this is escalating. Now we have riot police showing up. Now we have the use of riot control agents, aka tear gas and pepper spray and things of that nature. As of late Monday, campus, local, and state police had reportedly arrested about 50 people from an encampment gathering on the State University's South Mall. No encampments will be allowed, Texas Governor Greg Abbott wrote in a post on X, sharing a video of riot police with batons moving towards the assembled students. Instead, arrests are being made. Now, I just want to say that this doesn't look good either. And that's why this is such a difficult conundrum, right? I don't want free speech to be squashed by riot police. It's not good. I don't want certain groups of extreme ideologies to permeate into the youth of our college campuses and incite them to do something egregious either. And if the law enforcement wing has information or intelligence stating that there may be a threat of that kind within these events, can they just stand idly by? Right? So this is a tricky one, which is the best case scenario for those who want to see it spill over into something more contentious. Because in their planning, right, creating a powder keg requires everything to be very combustive. And by having things that could easily combust, you have a scenario that doesn't take a lot of sparks to ignite, right? I'm on an analogy or a metaphorical one tonight. I don't know what I'm doing here, but here we are, okay? All right, so earlier that day, the UT Police Department issued a dispersal order against the protesters, claiming they would be subject to disorderly conduct, okay, or they could be subject to it. Criminal trespass, riot, and obstruction charges. As police moved in to arrest the students, officers were seen zip-tying activists' hands behind their back and carrying one student away whose arms and legs had been tied, as the student could be heard saying, "You're choking me," which we know is a reference to everything that happened 4 years ago. In 2020. So, it sounds like it's escalating. Obviously, we have the Columbia situation, which has kind of been like the more focused catalyst of this event when it comes to spreading around the country. But we have the Columbia situation has moved to the school is finally saying no more. Anyone who is still remaining behind past the stated time is now being suspended and not being allowed to attend university-sponsored events, and then the police are coming in and arresting people, and then we're getting signs saying, Columbia will burn left behind. So we have the escalation there in the sense of threats and punishment, okay? But then we move over to the University of Texas in Austin here, and we've actually entered into the realm of riot police using riot control agents while also arresting students, and the governor of the state saying that this will not be acceptable and arrests will be made. So from one to the other, we're seeing a quantifiable escalation, right? So, let's talk about an even further escalation that has occurred in New Orleans, which you probably didn't hear about, because this is not getting national news coverage, strangely enough, but it is something that has happened, and it is something you should know, because these all are linked together. These protests are all organized and funded by the same groups. And this one has moved to the point of actually injuring police officers. So now we're escalating to violence, right? And see where this is going? This is why I'm taking you through this little journey here to kind of see how things are evolving when it comes to this scenario, okay? 12 people were arrested and 5 officers were injured following a pro-Palestinian protest at Jackson Square that police say turned violent on Sunday evening. Police originally said 10 arrests were made and 4 officers were injured, but in an update Monday around 2:30 p.m., increased the numbers. 5 officers reportedly sustained injuries from blows to the head and body during the altercation. They were transported to a local hospital, treated, and later released in stable condition. The NOPD says officers faced resistance while enforcing the park's closing time of 7 p.m. Protesters reportedly struck officers with items as the situation escalated. Charges for the protesters range from criminal trespass and battery on an officer to hate crimes on law enforcement and resisting arrest. The following individuals were arrested and charged. Now, I'm not going to read all of these because most of them are very repetitive, but keep in mind the age range here. It kind of gives you an insight that this group, those who were arrested, aren't necessarily representative of the age group that were being reported on in the mainstream media, right? We're being told, or at least led to believe, that the majority of these protesters, at least, college campuses, are, young people who maybe, just aren't quite sure about what they're doing, right? You're thinking 18 to 20-year-olds, people in that age range. But everyone arrested in this particular incident is in their 20s, most of them in their late 20s, one as old as 37 years old, right? Now, colleges and universities, of course, have people of all ages. I mean, shoot, we know that genius kid from school who was like 13 that graduated college, right? There's always that one kid. But we also have people in their 60s and 70s going back to college because they're just wanting to learn more or possibly trying to earn that PhD or master's degree they never quite finished up, or who knows what else, right? It's always good to continually educate yourself. So it's understandable that there'd be a wide range of ages, but based on these ages here, we're talking about seasoned adults, right? These aren't young kids who didn't know better or weren't really sure, what they were doing legally or whatnot. We're talking, late 20s, early 30s, and as old as 37 years old here. These are adults. These are people who probably have families, right? So keep that in mind because it kind of gives you that insight to the fact that not everyone involved with these incidents is some 18-year-old kid who just didn't know any better, right? It's kind of a good reminder of that too, especially when it comes to the people who are actually arrested, the people who are actually committing violent crimes against police officers, all were, well, what I would assume, like situated adults, right? I had my first kid at 27 years old. I was managing large numbers of staff by that point in time. I was an established adult, right? At 27. These people are 37 years old throwing rocks at police. And it should tell you something. Okay. Now, let's see here. We have Kenneth Hopp in here asking Red Scout if you're familiar with 3 of 7 Project. 3 of 7 Project is another YouTube channel. I believe the host is a former Navy SEAL. And I've watched some of his videos, and he's got some entertaining stuff, and he's got some good insight when it comes to like firearms and stuff like that. He's very physically oriented in the sense of fitness. And he has some, let's just say, interesting opinions on certain things sometimes. But so far, from what I've seen, it's been a pretty good channel. I don't always agree with everything the guy says, but I do think he puts out good information. And at least he's willing to say how he actually feels and give his truthful opinion to everyone, rather than questioning whether or not he goes one way or the other, right? Or, like how many here in this chat are wondering if Magic Prepper is really a Fed or not. And what I can say is that, to my knowledge, I'm not. But if that pension check ever shows up, I'll let you all know, because then I'll just be like, well, I guess you guys were right. This whole time I thought I was going to be totally screwed in my retirement, but here we are. So, all right, now let's go. What about the police response? Well, there's been some interesting rumors. I don't think these are necessarily something to latch onto, but I do think it can show where this can escalate to. And I also think it's not completely unreasonable, but it does create alarm for those who just don't really understand law enforcement in general and only look at them as being a negative entity, right? So the people who are going to either commit crime or are just under the belief that law enforcement's only mission statement is to violate your rights, right? So we have those groups out there, of course, and not all cops are bad and not all cops are good. They're people just like everyone else, but they do have a job to do. So I try to look at this as objectively as I can. UNR, rumors that sniper was staged at protest are untrue. First off, I wouldn't doubt it if there was one there, because public safety, I don't know. Maybe there was intelligence. Like I said, we're not privy to every bit of information that law enforcement receives when it comes to people who might be involved with some of these protests. It's just the way it is. When they have ties to some of these groups that have ties to actual terrorist entities, are you supposed to ignore that fact from a law enforcement perspective? Are you supposed to assume that even though there may be that tie, that there's zero likelihood of there being some sort of kinetic incident? I would assume not. Following a protest in support of Palestine at the University of Nevada, Reno, on Friday, organizers are claiming through social media that UNR police staged a sniper across the street with a gun pointed at student demonstrators. UNR Police Chief Eric James told 2 News Nevada on Monday that those allegations are not true. Part of what we do is we had what we call an OP out there, an observation post. Basically an elevated position looking down at the crowds, looking at the forward and the aft of the situation to make sure they're able to call out anything that we need to see as a protective measure. Sounds reasonable to me. Definitely a likely tactic to be used by law enforcement during a large gathering that has the potential to become a riot or the potential to have something bad happen. Because one thing a lot of people seem to be forgetting, that the ones who are upset about these types of measures, is what we went back to at the very beginning of this live stream. So if you just chimed in recently, just so you're aware, if you want to go back on the replay, we talked about campus safety, talking about why campuses and education centers are soft targets for a terrorist attack, right? So knowing all that information, these are important places to protect and also be on the lookout of, right, when it comes to those types of attacks. But I also have zero doubt that if they had an observation post that was elevated, that could see every aspect of this protest, I have zero doubt the people in that observation post had weapons and likely a rifle. And so maybe they're going off of the, let's just say, nomenclature aspect to still tell the truth here, right? Like, no, there was no sniper rifle. It was an SPR. It wasn't a sniper rifle. It was a 5.56 18-inch barreled rifle with a 2 to 12x scope on it. That's not a sniper rifle, right? So I don't know, but I have zero doubts they had a weapon up there. That's just me. But anyway, he added that the officer did not draw a gun or point a firearm at protesters. James said that Route 91 Harvest shooting in Las Vegas in 2017 prompted law enforcement agencies across the nation to use observation posts as a protective measure for large crowds. Anytime that we have something like that, whether it's a protest or a large gathering, we're there, he said. Okay? Seems reasonable, but it does create an environment where the perception of armed coercion exists, right? And so what do I mean by that? Well, consider this. And this is me trying to be, as unbiased as possible. I'm trying my best to understand both sides of the equation here. So don't take what I'm about to say as my personal opinion, but I want you to consider this idea, this concept, okay? So let's say you were protesting a tyrannical regime. Let's say you were in the 1700s living as an American, colonist, and everything was about to go off when it came to the Revolutionary War, right? And so let's say you're at a protest and you were just saying everything that you were upset about when it came to being under the thumb of tyranny. And you were allowed to protest. The British allowed it, let's just say. You were allowed to gather in a large group there. But the stipulation was, in order for you to be able to protest, you were going to have, have guns pointed at you. For your safety, of course, right? Or for the safety of those nearby. Do you actually feel free to say what you want with a gun pointed at you? Right? it doesn't necessarily equate to that here in this part of the conversation when we're talking about observation posts being set up in order to make sure nothing bad happens at a university. But it does give you something to consider, that it can quell free speech to a degree due to the fear that it instigates in those who are involved, right? I'm not saying those people are right to feel that way. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying that that's a consideration to make. And rarely throughout history has anybody felt comfortable speaking their mind to the fullest degree while having a weapon aimed at them, right? That's just the truth. I don't know what to say. Not everybody wants to become a martyr, right? So even if it's allowed, let's say you're in, I don't know, ancient China, and the emperor says, "Yeah, tell me all your problems. Tell me what it is you don't like about me. Nothing will happen to you, I promise." And all the armed guards are standing around with their spears ready to go. How many people are actually going to say every single thing they actually think and feel, right? So I just try to consider those things. Now, I can understand the practicality of it, especially knowing that these groups have these ties. And like I said at the beginning of the episode tonight, which we're calling it an episode now apparently, that we witnessed this throughout the 1970s of these protest movements moving on to bombings, mass bombings throughout all the major cities in the United States. That there is a potential for these things to escalate to a level of danger. So I get it, but I understand where this becomes a slippery slope and where this becomes a dampening of the freedom of speech in a way, right? I'm trying my best here. I really want to think of it from another perspective if possible, because that helps me formulate a better opinion about everything that's happening, okay? Now, let's move forward here. Because this isn't just in Reno, right? Snipers were allegedly spotted at Ohio State University and Indiana University during Gaza protests. Here's what we found. This is from Snopes, who I don't trust at all. But this does give you a quick glimpse into what has been seen and what could be the new norm when it comes to some of these scenarios, which, does that ever go away? Or does it only escalate to more and more armed oversight of these types of scenarios? Like, these are things to keep in mind, right? How many people would have been, okay, I'm trying to find a good example here because it's hard to find the other side of the equation, since we know the federal government generally has most of these people under surveillance anyway. But let's just say, you had a Pro-2A rally, and every major building around it had snipers on the roof, right? How does that make you feel? Do you feel comfortable in that situation, especially since everybody at the rally is probably armed, right? Like, that's the type of environment that gets created here, and then it becomes the norm for any other large-scale event. And then you start having situations where the people get together to protest other things besides what's happening right now, things that might be important regarding our personal freedoms, right? And then you have to do it while having a gun pointed at you. That I'm trying my best to really Anyway, as pro-Palestinian protests multiplied on U.S. campuses on April 25th through the 26th, universities called on local and state police to remove protesters' encampments. 2 photographs circulated online and posts claiming that the state police snipers had set up on the roofs of buildings at Ohio State University and Indiana University. The OSU newspaper The Lantern reported that the people on the roof of the OSU building were initially using spotting scopes to watch protesters, but switched to rifles once arrests began on the green space below. To date, we have not been able to confirm whether there was a sniper on the roof of the IU building. The university declined to comment. Snopes is awaiting comment from the Indiana State Police, but various sources appear to agree that there was a rooftop sniper at IU. As pro-Palestinian protests multiplied on U.S. campuses, 2 photographs circulated widely on social media. Okay, here's the one from Ohio. All right, and this does look like an observation post, right? And then we also have the one from Indiana, which is this one right here, which I can go to X real quick just to kind of show that. But it's an observation post. But in this particular photo, it does certainly seem that a rifle has come out. So that's where we're at. Oh, give me a second. Sorry. I didn't switch the screens. I didn't realize X was going to open a new tab. This is Indiana. So, as you can see, I mean, it definitely appears to be someone with a rifle on the roof. Now, for all I know, that's just a standard operating procedure used by law enforcement in these situations. But you can see how that could escalate to something more cynical or even tyrannical in the future. And we just have to question, is this something we want to always have? Now, is it for your protection? Quite possibly. But what if the protest is against the police, right? Or against the police state that has developed, or against a unreasonable declaration of martial law, or a curfew, or anything else, maybe a lockdown, right? Maybe another 2020 go-round. And then anywhere you go to demonstrate that discontent, you're in the crosshairs, right? I can see how both sides of this are in a tough spot. In reality, like I said before, it's the perfect storm of everybody has contention, and it doesn't take much to create a very explosive event. Okay. JW says we are turning into the Hunger Games. And the hungrier we get, the more likely that'll be. John Doe, 1776. If it's the Navy, don't worry. The scope is on backwards. That is hilarious. And I will never forget that. I think it's amazing. Northern Girl Hobby says grow food. I completely agree. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to also bring up is, interestingly enough, when I first started this channel, I had an LPVO on a rifle, and it was in a video, and somebody started commenting on it, asking me why I had the scope on backwards. And it's because at the time, LPVOs just weren't as prolific, right? And so people looked at it, and it looked weird and wrong. So they assumed that I put it on backwards because the thick end was at the back instead of in the front, right? Now we are all making fun of the Navy for actually putting an LPVO on backwards. But 5 years ago, I literally had to defend myself saying, no, it's on correctly, I promise. And I had multiple comments being like, your scope's on backwards. What's wrong with you? So how far we have come, right? Now, let's see here. Water the Tree says it doesn't matter how you attach your scope on Clown World. That's right. Okay, moving forward. This is where the slippery slope begins to develop. And this is why I get concerned about all of these things. We can see how it can be leveraged towards an end that's not good for anyone. Members of New York State Senate Republican Conference calling governor to deploy the National Guard and demand resignation of Columbia University president. Okay. I said, don't forget, this is a private university. All right. Let's see here. Senate Deputy Republican Leader Andrew Lanza, Senate Republican Leader Rob Ort, along with members of the New York State Senate Republican Conference today, called on Governor Kathy Hochul to immediately deploy the National Guard to protect Jewish students at Columbia University and to join their call for the resignation of the Columbia University president, Manoush Shafiq, who has shown herself to be incapable of restoring safety and order on her campus. The letter to the governor follows a week of pro-Hamas protests. See, there it is. Now it's pro-Hamas. Whoever is talking about the protest has their own word for it now. Protests at Columbia University and neighboring campuses. Oh, and by the way, that's not me trying to say it's not pro-Hamas. That's just me making sure you're aware that they have a lot of different words for what these protests are now. And neighboring campuses expressing support for violent terrorists, harassing and instilling fear into their Jewish classmates, attacking NYPD officers with bottles, and calling for the deaths of Jews. The Columbia protests follow the horrifying attacks of October 7th and subsequent months of hate-filled demonstrations on college campuses across the country. Chants heard at Columbia over the past week have included, "We are Hamas, Hamas make us proud, and kill another soldier now." Okay, that is what the letter to the governor said about why the National Guard should be deployed. Now, listen, regardless of whether or not I agree with some of the statements being said at these protests, which I genuinely do not, I will say that in my mind, speech of that degree is still speech, and I don't necessarily want to censor stuff just because it's disgusting or whatever you want to call it, right? Like that's not, to me, that's not freedom of speech to like at a point, right? Now, do I think it warrants calling the National Guard? Well, that's things become very troubling then, because now we have the National Guard, in the subway stations. We're going to have the National Guard at the college universities. We're going to have the National Guard at the southern border. Next, we're going to need them at the northern border. And we're going to have the National Guard at the grocery store because of the food shortage and the fact that it's becoming too dangerous to acquire the food that everyday families need, right? Like, so this escalation of the use or the suggested use of the National Guard mixed with the possibility of that turning problematic very quickly as well. So let's go to the other side of the aisle for the other side of this argument. This is clearly somebody who is very biased in the sense of being a Republican, right? And they're going to look at this through that lens, right? So let's go to the other side of the aisle, which there is some reason behind some of what they're stating as well. And that's not always something I get to say very often. Senator Kaine says sending National Guard to college campus protests would be a very, very bad idea. Senator Tim Kaine, Virginia, on Sunday advised against sending the National Guard onto college campuses to quell the pro-Palestinian protests occurring across the country, calling the prospect a very, very bad idea. I think calling in the National Guard to college campuses for so many people would recall what happened when that was done during the Vietnam War, and it didn't end well. The National Guard going to college campuses, Kent State and elsewhere, did not end well, Kaine said on Sunday on NBC News' Meet the Press. Which is true. It did not end well. And I think that would be a very, very bad idea. I think there are other ways using campus security, but also, again, offering students more opportunities to have dialogue that is civil and constructive where people hear one another, he continued. Now, that part I don't agree with. Why is that? Because the people who are involved with these protests do not want to have civil and constructive conversations. They only want to tell you their side of the argument, and then they don't believe any other side of the argument actually exists or has any justification. So I don't think that's a possibility, but of course this is wishful thinking from somebody who has that type of a mindset. Some GOP lawmakers have suggested the White House should send in the National Guard as protests over the Israel-Hamas war roil college campuses across the country. Several schools authorized local and state police to break up the protests, and hundreds of students have been arrested as a result. Who benefits the most from this? Who does? Who gets the most out of all of this? It's literally our enemies. It is. That's just the truth. It's not the students who think that they're winning some kind of righteous ideological argument. It's not regular everyday Americans who are just trying to go to work and maybe are paying for one of these students to go to these universities by working 2 or 3 jobs just to find out their kid is now getting arrested and suspended because of some foreign conflict that they don't necessarily even fully understand, right? None of us are benefiting from this. Our foreign adversaries are. And the organizations who fund and organize these protests are definitely benefiting from it. They're getting more traction. They're getting more exposure, more media attention, which means they can recruit, right? And they can campaign, raise funds more easily. And then who else gains from this? Well, the police state, authoritarianism. Because if something bad happens at any of these protests, well, there's another reason to put in a new law, put in a new regulation, put in a new mandate, right? Hire more IRS agents, because of protests, right? Arm up the police more. Get some more MRAPs on the street. Get some more RPGs out there on Main Street, right? So the only people who lose here are people like us. It makes our universities less safe. It makes our streets less safe. It makes our youth less safe who are at these universities. It also makes our rights less safe to being trampled upon by the police state. So it's very tough, these are the best case scenarios for those who want to see the demise of the United States of America. Any situation that's hard to navigate, generally is hard to navigate because there's no good outcome or there's no winnable solution, right? The only way to get through it is to go through it. And if it's a minefield, which this is becoming very quickly, something's going to pop off before you get to the other side. Somebody's going to lose a leg, right? If not, their entire life. So these are the events that are being created, not organically, right? They're being created on purpose to cause a difficult situation to navigate. And the only thing we'll know as just regular everyday Americans is what happens once we get to the other side, how things will be. That's all we'll know. We're not going to figure out anything in the meantime. Which is what it seems like to me. So, Florida Sheepdog 1 says, don't send in the Guards, send in the Patriots. Well, that creates its own list of issues as well. And that creates just as much disruption and just as much opportunity for the instigators and the authoritarians alike. In fact, probably more in some ways. That's why it's such a difficult scenario. There is no winner other than, like I said, foreign adversaries. So, listen, all of you are awesome. But it is about time to wrap this up. So, if you haven't hit the like button yet, please do so. Make sure you share this live stream with somebody that you think would benefit from listening to it. I appreciate all of the support. You guys are amazing. If you're new here, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you get notified about these live streams in the future. And of course, I put out video content throughout the week also. Now, if you are a YouTube channel member or a Subscribe Star member, you will get access to the private live stream tonight. Those links have not yet been posted, but they will be posted as soon as this live stream is over. If you want to join the Subscribe Star, it's $5 a month. It goes to directly support this channel, gives you access to private live streams, as well as the ability to communicate directly with me. And if I am not overwhelmed with everything I have going on, occasional exclusive content, because I've been bad about that lately, which I can openly admit. But I do have a preparedness incentive going out here very soon for one of my Subscribe Star members that will be pretty awesome. So I'm pretty excited to announce that here soon. And then if you're a YouTube channel member, you can also be in the private live stream. That link will be posted in the community tab on my channel page just for you. If you're a Subscribe Star member, it'll be posted on the Subscribe Star main page. And then if you want to be a YouTube channel member, hit the join button down below and you can be part of that private stream tonight. It starts at 9:45 Central Standard Time, which is in about 12 minutes. So, Cherokee Survival, glad you were here. Thank you so much. Northern Girl Hobbies, thank you so much for modding tonight. Much appreciated. All of you are amazing. Curb Creeper, you got to catch the replay. That's okay. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you coming back to listen to the information once you have the time. So, hopefully all of you are still preparing. Hopefully all of you are being very vigilant and having a lot of situational awareness whenever you're in a major city that has a major university, because these events don't necessarily have to stay on campus. And I assume, based on what we're seeing in New York City as well as other parts of the country, it'll spill over onto city streets as well. And I expect similar disruptions to what we saw during the summer of 2020, which, like I said, was an election year. Wow, what a surprise. Anything else you need from me at all, go to magicprepper.com. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.